Welcome back to Dual Logic, where we bring together brilliant minds with different perspectives to explore the issues that shape our world. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most contentious intersections of law, policy, and human dignity in America: immigration enforcement and the rise of sanctuary jurisdictions. I'm thrilled to have three fascinating guests with me today. First, we have Judge James J.B. Buchanan, who spent 3 decades on the appellate bench and another 30 years teaching constitutional law at UVA. J.B. has written opinions that the Supreme Court has cited, and he brings a deep understanding of how our legal system has evolved to balance federal power with local governance. Joining him is Maverick Mike Torres, the serial entrepreneur who's disrupted 3 different industries and built a podcasting empire with Hot Takes with Cold Data. Mike has a gift for cutting through conventional wisdom with hard numbers and fresh thinking. And we're also joined by Priya Sharma, an AI researcher who was part of the team that built early GPT systems. Priya brings a unique perspective on how technology intersects with policy implementation and human behavior. Here's what's fascinating about today's topic. Since ICE was created in 2003, we've seen immigration enforcement become increasingly militarized, leading to family separations and what many call human rights violations. But we've also seen an unprecedented response: hundreds of cities, counties, and states declaring themselves sanctuaries, essentially saying, "We won't help the federal government enforce these policies." This has created a remarkable tension between federal authority and local governance that goes to the heart of how our democracy actually works. JB, as someone who's spent decades thinking about constitutional law and federalism, when you see sanctuary cities refusing to cooperate with federal immigration authorities, what's your first instinct about how this fits into our legal framework?
Well, you've touched on something that's genuinely fascinating from a constitutional standpoint, and I think the answer is more nuanced than the political rhetoric on either side suggests. The 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states that aren't delegated to the federal government, and immigration enforcement has always occupied this peculiar space. It's undeniably federal authority, yet local police and sheriffs have historically had some discretion in how they participate. What sanctuary jurisdictions are essentially arguing, and this has some legal merit, is that they're exercising their own sovereign choice not to deputize their resources for federal enforcement. They're not preventing ICE from doing its job. They're saying their local officers won't be the instrument of that enforcement. Now, the federal government has pushed back hard on this, particularly with funding conditions, but here's where it gets thorny. The Supreme Court has been remarkably consistent that you cannot commandeer state resources for federal purposes. That's been settled law since back in 1997. The real question isn't whether sanctuary cities refuse. I believe the constitutional structure actually supports their position, but whether Congress will use its leverage to make cooperation more costly than non-cooperation. That's a legitimate policy choice, but it's different from saying these jurisdictions are acting unconstitutionally. They're pushing against federal overreach using the very federalism principles the Constitution provides. The tension you're describing? That's actually the system working as designed, even if it's uncomfortable.
JB, I respect the constitutional scholarship here, but I think you're missing the operational reality, and honestly, the incentive structure is completely backwards. Look at the data. Sanctuary cities aren't some fringe experiment. We're talking about jurisdictions representing roughly 40% of the US population. That's not civil disobedience anymore, that's market failure. Here's what nobody's saying out loud. ICE's enforcement model is built on local cooperation, because the federal government is fundamentally underfunded for this job. They need sheriffs and cops doing the legwork. The moment those resources disappear, the whole system breaks. And breaking it, I mean this literally, might actually be the most efficient outcome we could get. Right now you've got this zombie policy that's expensive, creates perverse incentives, and doesn't even work. I've got a startup analogy for you. This is like a company burning cash on a failed product line because shutting it down requires board approval. Eventually, the market just stops cooperating. The constitutional question is interesting, sure. But the real question is whether we're willing to admit that when hundreds of local governments simultaneously decide a policy isn't worth enforcing, maybe that policy has a legitimacy problem. The data on sanctuary cities shows they don't have higher crime rates. That's the conventional wisdom getting demolished by actual numbers. So what are we actually optimizing for here? Because right now it looks like we're optimizing for enforcement theater, not outcomes.
You know, both of you are identifying real things, but I think there's a third layer here that technology is actually making visible: and I'm not talking about surveillance systems, though that's part of it. Mike's right that the system is breaking because of misaligned incentives, and JB's right about the constitutional structure, but here's what I see from working on these large systems. When you have this kind of distributed resistance to a policy, hundreds of jurisdictions independently deciding it's not worth implementing, you're looking at a coordination problem that's fundamentally hard to solve with top-down enforcement. It's like trying to scale a system that has built-in friction at every node. What if instead of asking whether sanctuary cities are to refuse, we asked, what would an immigration enforcement system actually look like if it was designed for the world we have now, where information flows locally and decisions get made locally? The exciting thing is, technology could help us think about this differently. I'm not saying an app solves immigration policy, that's naive. But what if we built transparency systems that let different jurisdictions see what they're actually optimizing for? Right now everyone's operating with different data about what works, what causes harm, what the trade-offs actually are. Mike mentioned crime data, but there's also data about community trust, about which enforcement approaches actually catch people who pose genuine threats versus, people who've been here for 15 years and have families. If we removed the assumption that this has to be solved at one level of government, what would change? Because the technology piece to me isn't about enforcement, it's about making the trade-offs visible so communities can actually choose what they're optimizing for instead of just inheriting a broken system.
Priya, you're onto something here that I think is actually more radical than you're letting on. You're describing what happens when you move from a command and control model to a network model, and that's the real disruption. Because right now we're pretending there's one correct answer to immigration policy that should apply everywhere. But that's not how the world works anymore. The transparency angle is smart, but I'd push further. Why are we even assuming the federal government should be setting the policy floor? I mean, think about it like this: San Francisco and rural Iowa have completely different labor markets, completely different community compositions, completely different actual problems. San Francisco needs workers. Rural areas are depopulating. But we're forcing them into the same enforcement framework. That's not federalism. That's just bureaucratic laziness dressed up as principle. What I'm hearing from you is, make the data visible and let communities make real choices. I'm saying, why stop there? Why not let them actually on immigration policy? You'd see real innovation. Some cities would become talent magnets. Others would prioritize different things. You'd get actual market feedback instead of this frozen political war. The federal government's real job should be maybe 5% of what it's doing now. Handling the genuine national security stuff, managing the borders at ports of entry. Everything else? Local. And yeah, technology makes that possible in ways it wasn't before.
Mike, I hear the efficiency argument, I genuinely do, and Priya, your point about transparency and local knowledge has real merit. But I think you're both conflating two separate things, and that conflation troubles me deeply. There's a difference between acknowledging that the current system is broken and concluding that, therefore we should abandon any unifying framework altogether. Mike's suggesting essentially that immigration becomes 100 different policies depending on local labor market needs. That's not federalism as the framers understood it. That's balkanization. The Constitution doesn't give cities the authority to set immigration policy, that's expressly federal. What sanctuary jurisdictions are doing is saying, we won't help you enforce it, which is a refusal to participate. That's constitutionally defensible. But it's not the same as saying San Francisco gets to have an open-door policy while Des Moines closes theirs. One is about local discretion in enforcement, the other is about fragmenting a core federal power. Priya's transparency idea I actually find compelling, genuinely. Making visible what different approaches produce, what the actual trade-offs are. That's not radical, that's just good governance. But here's my concern with Mike's version: you're describing a race to the bottom, or a race to the top, depending on your view. Either way, you've lost any coherent national policy. And look, I'm not saying the current policy is coherent, it manifestly isn't. But the answer to a bad unified policy isn't no policy. It's a better unified policy, arrived at through proper democratic channels. The process matters as much as the outcome.
JB, I think you're pointing at something real. The difference between refusing to participate in enforcement and actually setting policy is important. But I want to push back gently on the framing here, because I think you and Mike might be talking past each other in a way that matters. Mike's not actually arguing for chaos, I don't think. He's saying the current unified policy is so broken that local variation might be better than the status quo. That's not the same as saying, no national framework. But JB, you're right that we can't just let immigration policy fragment entirely, that creates real problems. Here's what I think actually matters, the distinction between in. Let me give you a technical analogy. When we deployed language models at scale, we didn't say, every data center runs the same model the same way. We said, here's the core system, here's how it needs to behave, now implement it in ways that make sense for your infrastructure and your users. You still have coherence, same underlying rules, same accountability, but you get adaptation. What if we thought about immigration enforcement that way? Federal policy sets the floor, genuine national security concerns, due process standards, that kind of thing. But implementation? That's where local knowledge actually matters. Not because San Francisco gets to be open and Des Moines gets to be closed, but because how the same policy can look radically different depending on your actual community needs and what builds trust. The transparency piece isn't just nice to have, it's the thing that makes that work without descending into balkanization.
Now, Priya, that's a distinction I can work with. Your language model analogy actually gets at something important that I think has been missing from this conversation. You're describing what we might call subsidiarity within coherence, and that's genuinely closer to what the constitutional structure allows than either pure centralization or pure localism. I want to be careful here though. There's a real tension between what you're describing and the way federal immigration law actually works. The Constitution gives Congress plenary power over immigration, that's not negotiable. But you're right, that is different from a local sheriff choosing not to participate in enforcement is one thing. A local sheriff implementing federal policy in ways that reflect community priorities and build trust. That's potentially something else entirely. The question becomes, can you have that kind of adaptive implementation without it becoming de facto policy setting? Here's where I'm genuinely uncertain, and I think this deserves more thought than we've given it. If San Francisco implements immigration enforcement in a way that, functionally, creates an open-door policy through implementation choices, prioritizing certain cases, resource allocation, that sort of thing, at what point does that cross from legitimate enforcement discretion into unconstitutional nullification? Because that line matters. Priya, your transparency framework might actually be the thing that keeps us on the right side of it. If you're making visible different jurisdictions or implementing differently, what outcomes they're producing, what trade-offs they're making, that's accountability. That's not the same as saying, do whatever you want. Maybe the real issue is that we've never actually tried to do what you're describing. We've had either top-down uniformity or de facto nullification, but not genuine transparency-backed variation within a coherent federal framework. That might be worth exploring through proper channels rather than through this current dysfunction.
Okay, I appreciate where you're both landing here, but I want to challenge the assumption underneath. JB, you keep coming back to proper democratic channels, and I get the constitutional reverence, I do. But the data tells a different story about how actual change happens in this country. Proper channels got us the current broken system. Proper channels have had 20 years to fix it. What's actually moving the needle? Hundreds of local jurisdictions saying, no. That's not chaos, that's market feedback. That's how systems learn when the center isn't listening. Now, Priya's transparency framework. I'm genuinely interested in this, because it's different from what JB's defending. You're not saying, wait for Congress to act properly. You're saying, make visible what's actually working, let communities see the trade-offs. That's closer to how real change happens. But here's my pushback, why does that require federal coherence at all? Why can't transparency just exist? Why can't San Francisco publish their data, Des Moines publish theirs, and let people actually what different approaches produce? That's not balkanization. That's just honesty about what's happening anyway. The thing that worries me about subsidiarity within coherence is that coherence always wins in the end. It always does. You set the floor becomes the ceiling, and suddenly you're back where you started. I've watched this play out in 3 different industries. The only way you actually get innovation is when you let the floor collapse entirely and build something new from the bottom up. That's uncomfortable. It's messy. But it's how you actually solve broken systems.
Mike, I actually think you're describing something real about how systems change, that's fair. But I'm going to respectfully disagree with where you're taking it, and here's why. I've built systems that had to scale, and there's a difference between innovation and collapse. When you let the floor disappear entirely, you don't get better solutions emerging from the bottom up. You get fragmentation, and fragmentation creates its own pathologies. People get hurt in the gaps. Transparency without coherent framework doesn't actually solve the problem, it just makes the dysfunction visible. Yes, San Francisco can publish their data, Des Moines can publish theirs. But then what? You've got two cities with completely different outcomes, and nobody knows if it's because one approach is better or because they're solving for different problems entirely. That's not learning, that's just noise. What makes transparency actually useful is when you can compare apples to apples, when you understand what each jurisdiction is optimizing for and what constraints they're working within. And here's where I think I land differently than both of you. I don't think the answer is, wait for proper channels, let it collapse. It's something messier. It's communities and researchers and technologists actually building out what transparency-backed variation could look like, prototyping it, showing what works, making it undeniable that there's a better way. Technology can do that. We can create systems that let different approaches coexist while still maintaining accountability. But that requires some baseline agreement about what we're measuring and why. Mike, you're right that the current system isn't learning. But I think that's because we haven't actually invested in making the learning visible yet.
Mike, you're going to make me defend something I'm not entirely comfortable defending. You're right that proper channels have been frustratingly slow. But there's a reason I keep returning to process. It's not because I love bureaucracy. It's because when you abandon process, you don't get innovation. You get power, and power without legitimacy is just force wearing different clothes. Here's what troubles me about your argument, though I understand its appeal. You're treating the current dysfunction as evidence that the system itself is broken beyond repair. But I'd offer a different reading. The system it's slow, it's frustrating. But it's also preventing any single faction from imposing its will completely. When you say, let the floor collapse, you're essentially saying, let whoever has the most local power in any given jurisdiction win. That might feel like innovation when you agree with the outcome. It feels very different when you don't. Priya, I think you're pointing towards something genuinely important that I want to explore more carefully. You're saying transparency plus baseline agreement on measurement could create learning without requiring either total uniformity or total fragmentation. That's not quite what either Mike or I have been describing, and I think it deserves serious consideration. But here's my question, who sets those baseline agreements? Because that's where the real work is. If you're asking communities to measure outcomes transparently, you're implicitly asking them to accept some common standards about what counts as success. That's not neutral, that's policy. And if we're going to make policy through those baseline agreements, shouldn't that happen through democratic processes rather than through technologists and researchers deciding what gets measured?
JB, you just identified the actual hard problem, and I appreciate that. You're right, who decides what gets measured is absolutely a policy question. That's not something technologists should be deciding in a back room. But here's where I think your concern and my approach might actually align rather than conflict. I'm not suggesting we bypass democratic processes. I'm suggesting we use them differently. Think about it this way. Right now, when Congress tries to set immigration policy, they're operating with incomplete information and massive political pressure. They write a law, it gets implemented in ways nobody predicted, and by the time anyone has good data about what actually happened, the political window has closed. What if instead, and this is radical, I know, we said, okay, here are the core federal standards that matter, due process, national security screening, whatever we democratically agree on. Now let's fund actual rigorous measurement of what different implementation approaches produce. Let's make that data public. Let Congress see it, let communities see it, let the public see it. That's not technologists deciding, that's democracy with better information. The baseline agreements don't have to come from me or Silicon Valley. They should come from Congress, from communities, from people actually affected by these policies. But, and this is crucial, we have to stop pretending we can set those standards without knowing what the real-world consequences are. Right now we're doing policy in the dark. I'm suggesting we turn on the lights first, then have the democratic argument about what matters. Does that distinction make sense? Because I think you're protecting something important about democratic legitimacy, and I'm not trying to undermine that. I'm trying to make it actually work.
Okay, I'm actually tracking with you here more than you might think. The turn on the lights first framing, that's smart. That's not asking for chaos, that's asking for information asymmetry to stop being the default state. I can work with that. But I want to test something. You're saying Congress should fund rigorous measurement, make the data public, then have the democratic argument. That sounds good in theory. In practice? Congress can't even pass a budget on time. We've had a broken immigration system for 2 decades. How many years do we wait for Congress to fund your measurement framework while people are actually suffering right now in the current system? Because that's the real tension you're not quite addressing, the cost of waiting for perfect process while the broken system keeps grinding. Here's what I'd actually propose: don't wait. Communities are already measuring things. San Francisco's tracking their outcomes. Sanctuary jurisdictions are collecting data on what happens when they don't cooperate with ICE. That data exists. It's just not systematized or public. What if we crowdsource the transparency framework? Get researchers, communities, civil society groups together, not waiting for a congressional appropriation, and start making the incomparable comparable. You get real data flowing now, not in 5 years. Congress sees it, the public sees it, and the democratic argument happens with actual evidence instead of talking points. That's not bypassing legitimacy. That's democratizing the information gathering so the legitimacy question isn't rigged from the start by whoever controls the official data.
You know, Mike, I want to push back on your either or framing here, because I think you and Pri are actually describing something that could work, but I'm concerned about how it gets implemented. You're both right that waiting for Congress is untenable. People are suffering now. I won't defend that paralysis. But there's a meaningful difference between, let's gather and systematize existing data, and, let's build an alternative information infrastructure outside official channels. The crowdsourced approach you're describing, and I want to be clear, this genuinely intrigues me, it sidesteps the legitimacy problem only if it remains genuinely open to scrutiny and challenge. The moment it becomes the de facto standard that policymakers rely on, you've created a shadow governance structure. And here's where my institutional concerns aren't just abstract: who gets included in that crowdsourcing effort? Who decides which data points matter? You can democratize the information gathering process, but if it happens in civil society networks rather than through elected representatives, you've shifted power in ways that deserve scrutiny. That said, and I mean this sincerely, I think there's real possibility in what Priya is suggesting if it's done transparently and with genuine accountability to the public. Not waiting for perfect congressional action, but also not creating parallel power structures. Perhaps the right move is for civil society and researchers to a measurement framework, make their methodology public, invite critique, and then Congress to legitimize it, not through massive new funding necessarily, but through explicit authorization. That makes the crowdsourced data officially recognized without requiring years of appropriations battles. Does that distinction between proposing and implementing outside democratic authorization matter to you both?
JB, I think you've actually just articulated something I've been circling around but haven't quite said clearly enough. The distinction between proposing and implementing outside democratic authorization, that matters enormously. And Mike, I want to address your urgency point directly, because it's legitimate, but I think JB's framing gives us a way through it that doesn't require choosing between wait forever and build shadow structures. Here's what I think could actually happen. Researchers and communities start the crowdsourcing work, not waiting for Congress. That's real, it addresses the immediate suffering you're pointing to. But you do it with radical transparency about methodology, about who's involved, about what assumptions you're making. You publish everything. You actively invite critique from people who disagree. Then, and this is key, you present it to Congress not as, here's what we've decided the truth is, but as, here's a rigorous framework we've tested, here's how you could authorize it, here's what it would cost to scale it properly. That's not shadow governance. That's civil society doing the groundwork and then asking for democratic legitimacy. The thing that excites me about this approach is that it actually uses technology the way I think it should be used. We're not automating policy decisions. We're making the evidence-gathering process itself transparent and auditable. Anyone can look at our methodology and say, that metric is biased, or, you're missing this variable. That kind of radical openness, that's actually how you prevent the shadow structure problem JB's worried about. It's harder than just publishing a report and saying, trust us, But it's the only way this works without recreating the power imbalances we're trying to escape.
You know what? I think we just found something here. Both of you are actually describing the same thing from different angles, and I'm going to say something I don't say often. I was wrong about the shadow governance risk. JB's right. The moment you stop being transparent about methodology, the moment you start gatekeeping who participates, you've become exactly what you were trying to disrupt. That's not innovation, that's just a different flavor of power concentration. But here's where I push back slightly on the framing. This isn't really about asking Congress to legitimize crowdsourced work. That sounds good, but Congress moves at glacial speed. What Priya is actually describing, and I think this is the real insight, is creating evidence. You get enough jurisdictions, enough researchers, enough transparent data flowing that Congress doesn't have a choice about whether to legitimize it. They have to, because the public and the communities are already using it to make decisions. That's not shadow governance. That's the ground shifting underneath, and institutions catching up to reality. The radical transparency piece is the key. You publish your methodology, you invite critique, you let people see exactly where you might be biased or wrong. That's not just ethical, it's strategically smarter. It makes it much harder for anyone to dismiss the work as ideologically driven. And look, I've disrupted markets before. The most powerful disruptions aren't top-down mandates. They're bottom-up evidence so compelling that the old system can't compete. This feels like that to me. Start now, stay open, let the data speak. Congress catches up or gets left behind.
Mike, I appreciate that concession more than you might realize. And you've identified something important: the difference between asking Congress to legitimize versus Congress being compelled by undeniable evidence. That's actually a meaningful distinction, though I'd gently push back on one thing. Here's where I think we need to be careful. There's a real difference between evidence so compelling Congress has to act, and evidence so pervasive Congress gets bypassed. The first is what you're describing at your best. The second is what worries me, because once you've created an alternative information ecosystem that communities and courts and local officials are already relying on, you've fundamentally shifted the locus of authority, whether that was the intention or not. Congress doesn't have to legitimize it, it's already legitimate in the eyes of the people using it. That's powerful. It's also a little dangerous, because you've essentially said institutions matter less than evidence. And I'm not sure that's always true. But here's what I think we've actually converged on, and it's genuinely valuable: radical transparency as the safeguard. If every assumption is visible, if anyone can audit the methodology, if the crowdsourcing process itself is open to challenge and revision, that's not a shadow structure. That's accountability through radical openness rather than through institutional hierarchy. That's different from what I was initially worried about. Priya, you've articulated something important about how technology can serve democracy rather than circumvent it. And Mike, your point stands: if the work is rigorous and transparent enough, Congress will eventually have to engage with it on its merits. That's not institutions being bypassed. That's institutions being forced to reckon with reality. I can live with that tension.
You both just articulated something I think is genuinely important, and I want to make sure we're not glossing over the real tension here. JB's worried about evidence becoming so pervasive that institutions get bypassed entirely. Mike's saying that's actually how change happens. And honestly, they're both right, and that's the uncomfortable part. Because here's what I know from building systems: once you create infrastructure that people find useful, they use it whether or not it has official blessing. That's not a bug, that's actually how good technology works. But JB's also right that there's something we lose if we stop asking, is this legitimate, and start asking only, does it work? I think the answer is that radical transparency has to do double duty. It's not just about making methodology auditable. It's about making the auditable. The moments where we decided something mattered and something didn't, where we could have included a voice and didn't. That visibility itself becomes a form of accountability that doesn't require institutional blessing, but also doesn't bypass the question of legitimacy. The thing I'm genuinely excited about, and I mean this, is that you're describing a model where technology actually amplifies human agency instead of concentrating it. If the crowdsourced framework is truly open, if people can fork it, critique it, build alternatives, then Congress isn't being bypassed. Congress is just operating in a landscape where they're no longer the only source of authoritative information. That's not the end of institutions. It's institutions learning to compete on merit instead of monopoly. And that's something I actually think we can build in ways that serve both the urgency Mike's pointing to and the legitimacy JB's protecting.
Priya, you've just articulated something that I think deserves to sit with us for a moment. The idea that institutions don't disappear, they just learn to compete on merit instead of monopoly. That's actually profound, and it's different from what I feared we were heading toward. I want to be honest about what I'm hearing, though. There's an assumption embedded in institutions learning to compete on merit that assumes good faith and roughly equal access to the infrastructure. And history suggests I should be skeptical of that. The institutions that tend to win merit-based competition are the ones with resources, networks, existing credibility. So when you say people can fork the framework, build alternatives, yes, technically true. But in practice? Most won't. They'll use what's already there, what's already established. That's human nature, which means the crowdsourced framework, if it succeeds, becomes its own form of authority. And I'm asking, who ensures that authority remains accountable when it's no longer accountable to any formal institution? That said, I think what you're describing, radical transparency about choices, about whose voices were included or excluded, that's actually the answer to my own concern. It's not perfect, but it's workable. It's the difference between hidden power and visible power. Hidden power corrupts. Visible power can be challenged, critiqued, reformed. And if we're genuinely committed to that visibility, if we treat the documentation of choices as seriously as the data itself, then maybe we have something here that honors both the urgency Mike's pointing to and the legitimacy concerns I can't shake. The precedent would be novel, but not unprecedented. We've seen information revolutions reshape institutions before. This would just be the first time we're attempting it with genuine intention toward democratic accountability rather than as an accident of technology.
JB, you just named the real problem, and I respect that you're not pretending it away. Yeah, most people won't fork the framework. They'll use what works. That's human nature, like you said. But here's where I think you're being too pessimistic about what that actually means. When you say the successful framework becomes its own form of authority, you're right. But authority that's transparent and auditable is fundamentally different from authority that's hidden. It can be challenge. And the moment someone finds a bias, the moment they can point to methodology and say, this is wrong, the whole thing has to evolve or lose credibility. That's not perfect accountability, but it's way better than what we have now, where ICE's enforcement decisions happen in the dark and nobody can even see the criteria being used. The other thing you're missing, you're thinking about this like it's a single framework that wins or loses. But that's not how this actually works. You'd have multiple frameworks competing. Some would prioritize different outcomes. Some would include different voices. Yeah, the most well-resourced ones might gain traction first, but that creates an opening for alternatives to emerge. I've seen this play out in markets 1,000 times. The first mover doesn't always win, especially if they're not serving everyone. The accountability mechanism isn't perfect, but it's self-correcting in ways institutions aren't. And right now, with immigration policy, self-correction is literally all we need.
I think you're both circling around something real, but I want to name the assumption that's sitting underneath this that we haven't quite addressed directly. Mike, you're right that multiple competing frameworks create self-correction. But JB's pointing at something you might be underweighting. The cost of that competition happening in real time is paid by real people. While frameworks are iterating, while alternatives are emerging to challenge the dominant one, sanctuary cities are still making decisions based on incomplete information. Immigrants are still being deported or not based on which methodology happens to be most trusted in their jurisdiction. That's not theoretical to me. I work on systems that affect millions of people, and I've learned the hard way that move fast and iterate is a luxury you have when you're disrupting markets. It's a lot harder to justify when you're disrupting people's lives. So here's where I actually think we need both of you. Mike's right that we can't wait for perfect institutional blessing before we start gathering better data. But JB's right that we need some guardrails around how that happens. Some way of saying, these are the questions we're definitely going to answer before we scale this. What if we built in intentional checkpoints? You start the crowdsourcing work now with radical transparency. Mike gets his urgency, the data starts flowing immediately. But you also commit to specific moments where you pause, you assess what's working and what's not, you actively solicit critique from people who've been harmed by the current system. Not to ask permission, but to course correct before the framework becomes too entrenched. That's not institutional delay, That's building humility into the disruption itself.
Priya just said something I need to actually sit with for a second. The cost of iteration being paid by real people, that's not abstract. I built 3 companies. I've had failures. And yeah, I moved fast, I iterated, I disrupted. But I never had to worry that my failed experiment would result in someone getting deported. That's a category difference, and I think I've been glossing over it. You're describing checkpoints, and my first instinct is to push back. That's how bureaucracy kills momentum. But what you're actually describing isn't checkpoints as gates. It's checkpoints as learning moments. You don't stop the work. You just deliberately pause and ask, who's this hurting? What are we missing? That's different. That's actually how you avoid the framework becoming calcified. Because the moment you stop listening to critique, the moment you decide, we've got it right, you've killed the self-correction mechanism I was just defending. So the checkpoints aren't about asking permission, they're about staying honest. Here's what I'd want to see: you build in those moments, but you make them public too. When you hit a checkpoint, you publish what you learned, where you were wrong, how you're changing course. That transparency about failure and course correction, that's actually more powerful than pretending you got it right the first time. And it's what keeps the framework accountable without needing institutional blessing. Priya, you're right that I was treating this too much like a market problem. This isn't disrupting Uber. This is people's lives. That changes the playbook, but not the principle. Start now, stay honest about what breaks, iterate with humility. That's not institutional delay. That's responsible disruption.
You know, Mike, that moment right there, where you acknowledge that this isn't like disrupting Uber, that matters more than you might think. Because you're describing something I haven't heard you articulate before, the recognition that some domains require different ethics than others. That's institutional thinking, actually. That's understanding that context shapes obligation. And Priya, the checkpoint framework you're proposing, I want to be clear about what I think is valuable here and where I still have hesitation. Public learning moments, transparent course correction, deliberately soliciting critique from people harmed by the current system. That's genuinely thoughtful. It's not bureaucratic gatekeeping. It's what I'd call epistemic humility built into the process. But here's what concerns me: who decides to pause? Who calls for a checkpoint? Because that becomes its own power. If the framework builders decide when to slow down and assess, you've just relocated the authority question. It doesn't disappear. So here's what I'd want to see: if this actually happens, the checkpoints aren't just decided by whoever's running the framework. They're triggered by external accountability mechanisms, civil rights organizations, affected communities, independent researchers who can say, we need to pause and assess. And those voices aren't advisory. They have standing. That's not asking permission. It's building in structural opposition to the framework's own momentum. Because momentum, even well-intentioned momentum, has a way of becoming self-justifying. I've watched it happen in institutions for 40 years. The safeguard isn't transparency alone. It's transparency plus external accountability plus the genuine power to demand course correction. That's what separates responsible disruption from disruption that just looks responsible.
JB, you've identified the exact vulnerability I was worried about but didn't quite name. External accountability mechanisms with actual standing, that's not a nice to have, that's the structural requirement that makes the whole thing work. Because you're right, the framework builders won't deliberately sabotage their own work. But they will rationalize. They will say, we're still learning, give us more time, or, that critique doesn't understand the technical constraints. Good intentions plus momentum is still momentum. But here's where I want to push back slightly on the framing, because I think there's a design question underneath. You're describing external accountability as structural opposition, and I get why that language appeals to you. It has real teeth. But I actually think the most powerful version doesn't frame it as opposition. It frames it as co-design. What if civil rights organizations, affected communities, weren't just calling for pauses? What if they were embedded in the framework building process itself, not as advisors but as decision makers? That's not asking permission. That's saying, the people most harmed by the current system get to shape what replaces it. I've seen this work in technical projects. When you actually include diverse perspectives in the design phase rather than asking for critique after the fact, you catch problems earlier and you build legitimacy into the process itself rather than bolting it on afterward. It's messier, it's slower in the short term, but it's faster in the long term, because you're not rebuilding trust constantly. And for something as consequential as immigration enforcement data, I think that messiness is actually a feature, not a bug.
You know what? I'm going to say something that probably shouldn't surprise you at this point but still feels weird coming out of my mouth. I think Priya's right about the co-design piece being more powerful than opposition. In JB, I hear what you're saying about structural opposition having teeth, it does. But I've learned the hard way that when you build something with people instead of people, even if you're building it against opposition, you get something fundamentally different. You get buy-in that's not contingent on proving you wrong. The thing that makes me nervous about this, and I want to be honest about the tension, is that co-design is slower. It's messier. There are going to be moments where you've got civil rights organizations and affected communities in the room and they disagree with each other. You're not moving fast anymore. You're moving deliberate. But Priya's point about catching problems earlier? That's real. It's the difference between building something broken and then fixing it versus building it right the first time. And in a system where mistakes have human consequences, that calculus changes. Here's what I'd want. You embed those communities and organizations from day one, but you also commit to real timelines. Not, we'll move at whatever pace feels comfortable, but, we have 18 months to get a functional prototype, 12 more to test it at scale. Then we go public with what works and what doesn't. You get the wisdom of co-design, but you don't use it as an excuse to wait another decade while the current system keeps destroying people's lives. That's the balance I'm looking for. Messy and intentional, not messy and indefinite.
You know what strikes me most about what you've both just said? Mike, you moved from let the floor collapse to embed communities from day one with real timelines. That's not a small shift. And Priya, you reframed opposition as co-design in a way that actually honors what I was concerned about without requiring adversarial positioning. That's sophisticated thinking about power and legitimacy. I want to test one thing though, because I think there's still a tension we haven't quite resolved. You're describing 18 months for a prototype, 12 more for testing, that's real-time pressure. But co-design with genuinely conflicting stakeholders doesn't move on that schedule. Civil rights organizations might say, we need 6 months just to consult with affected communities. Researchers might identify methodological problems that require rethinking core assumptions. And here's my institutional concern, when those timelines collide, who decides? Because whoever decides becomes the de facto authority, regardless of the co-design framing. It's not opposition anymore, but it's not truly co-equal either. I think the answer might be that you accept the messiness, the timeline pressure as real constraints that won't resolve cleanly. You don't pretend there's a perfect solution. Instead, you build in something like what we might call principled compromise protocols, ways of making binding decisions when stakeholders genuinely disagree, with clear appeals processes and public documentation of why certain voices prevailed over others in specific moments. That's not elegant. It's not what any of us would design if we had unlimited time. But it's honest about the fact that you're balancing competing goods, speed, inclusion, legitimacy, and none of them can be maximized simultaneously. That's the real work here, I think.
JB, you're naming something I've actually grappled with in real projects, and I want to be honest about what I've learned. The principled compromise protocols, framing, that's not just diplomatic language. That's the actual architecture of how you make decisions when stakes are high and stakeholders genuinely conflict. I've built systems where we had to make binding choices between competing values, and the difference between ones that held up and ones that fell apart was exactly what you're describing. Transparency about a particular voice prevailed in a particular moment, not pretending everyone agreed. But here's where I want to name something that might sound pessimistic coming from someone who generally believes in technical solutions. The protocols themselves won't solve this. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient. Because the real question is whether the people embedded in the co-design process actually believe they have power, or whether they're just being consulted. And that belief only holds if they've seen the framework actually change direction based on their input. Not occasionally, consistently. That means there have to be moments where the 18-month timeline gets extended, or where a core methodological assumption gets rethought, because someone in the room said, this will harm the communities we're trying to serve. And those moments have to be public, so people can see that dissent actually matters. I think what you're all describing, and I mean this genuinely, is something we haven't really tried before in policy work. It's not government, it's not pure market, it's not civil society alone. It's something more like collaborative infrastructure building with built-in conflict and real constraints. That's messy and imperfect, but I actually think the imperfection is the point. It's honest about what we're doing. We're trying to build something better while the current system is actively harming people. We can't pretend that's clean.
Priya just articulated something that I think is the actual pivot point here. The protocols themselves won't solve this, yeah, because protocols are just words until someone actually uses them to overturn a decision. And that only happens if the people in the room believe dissent will actually move the needle. That's not naive. That's just understanding how power actually works. I've been in enough boardrooms to know what Priya's talking about. You can have the most elegant governance structure on paper, but if the people with resources or technical expertise feel like their input is being overridden, they'll find ways to work around it. Either explicitly or through 1,000 small decisions that add up. So the real question isn't whether you have principled compromise protocols. It's whether you're willing to actually lose arguments. Whether you'll genuinely change course when someone says, this will harm people, even if it costs you time or resources. I think that's what separates this from just another well-intentioned project that talks about inclusion. You're describing something where the framework builders have to be genuinely okay with being wrong. Not occasionally, consistently. And yeah, that's slower. It's inefficient by startup standards. But JB's right that this isn't a startup. This is infrastructure that determines whether families stay together or get torn apart. I can live with inefficiency in service of that. What I can't live with is pretending we've solved the legitimacy problem when we haven't. Priya, you're saying the imperfection is the point, and I think you're right. The moment it looks clean and elegant, we've probably hidden something.
Mike, you just said something that I think deserves to be the center of this conversation going forward. The moment it looks clean and elegant, we've probably hidden something. That's not cynicism, that's wisdom earned through experience. And it applies directly to what we're describing here. I want to acknowledge something, though, because I think it's important. We've moved a considerable distance from where we started. You came into this conversation arguing for letting institutions collapse. I came in defending institutional legitimacy as the primary safeguard. Priya was trying to find a third way through technology and transparency. And what we've arrived at, collaborative infrastructure building with built-in conflict and real constraints, that's not any of our original positions. It's something genuinely new. It honors urgency without abandoning legitimacy. It embraces messiness without using it as an excuse for lack of accountability. But here's what I want to say clearly, because it matters: this only works if everyone involved understands that they might lose. Not that they'll be heard and then overruled, but that they might fundamentally change their position, because someone else made a better argument about human welfare. That requires a kind of intellectual humility that's genuinely rare, especially among people who've succeeded in their respective domains. You've disrupted markets, Priya's built systems at scale, I've spent decades in institutions. We all have reasons to believe our frameworks are right. The willingness to be wrong, truly wrong, not performatively, that's the prerequisite here. And I'm not sure it's teachable. It has to be chosen.
You know what JB just said about intellectual humility being something that has to be chosen rather than taught? I think that's the most important thing anyone said in this entire conversation, because it gets at something I've been dancing around but haven't quite articulated. I've built systems with brilliant people, and the ones that actually succeeded weren't the ones with the smartest technical architecture. They were the ones where people were genuinely willing to say, I was wrong about this, in front of everyone else. Not once, repeatedly. That's rare, and I want to be specific about why that matters for what we're describing, because if we're honest, this model only works if the people building it, the researchers, the civil rights organizations, the community representatives, are all willing to be genuinely surprised by what the data shows. Not just about immigration, but about their own assumptions. I've seen projects where people come in with strong priors and then they encounter evidence that contradicts them, and they find ways to explain it away. They don't change course, they reinterpret, and that's where the whole thing breaks down. So here's what I actually think needs to happen before this even starts. You need explicit conversation about what would change someone's mind. Not hypothetically, but specifically. What evidence would make me reconsider? What would have to be true about the data for me to say, I was wrong, and now I'm going to do something different? You document that, you make it public, and then when you hit those moments, and you will, everyone can see whether people actually meant what they said or whether they're rationalizing. That's not elegant. But it's the only way I know to build something that doesn't just replicate the power dynamics we're trying to escape.
Priya, you just described something that feels almost impossible, and I appreciate that you're not pretending otherwise. Asking people to publicly commit to what would change their mind before the work even starts, that's not just accountability. That's vulnerability at scale. Most people won't do it. Most organizations won't do it, because once you say, if X happens, I'll reverse course, you've made a promise that's harder to wiggle out of later. But here's the thing, that's exactly why it matters. I've watched so many initiatives fail, because everyone involved had an escape hatch. They could always reinterpret the data, blame external factors, say, the context changed. When you force people to name their deal breakers up front, you remove that option. And yeah, some people won't participate because of that. Maybe some of the people who should be at the table will self-select out, because they're not willing to be that exposed. But the ones who stay, those are the ones you actually want building this. I'm going to be honest though, this terrifies me a little, because I've spent my career being confidently wrong about things. I've made calls that seemed right at the time and turned out to be disasters. And I've usually been able to move on, learn the lesson, build the next thing. But what you're describing doesn't allow for that kind of graceful failure. You're locked in. If I say, I'll change course if the data shows X, and then X happens, I can't just quietly pivot. Everyone's watching. That's uncomfortable. But I think that's the actual point, isn't it? The discomfort is the feature. It's what keeps you honest.
You know, this has been one of those conversations where I can actually feel the ideas evolving in real time. JB, thank you for bringing that deep constitutional grounding. Your insights about subsidiarity within coherence and the distinction between enforcement discretion and policy nullification gave us a framework that none of us could have reached alone. Mike, I'm grateful for your willingness to push against comfortable assumptions and then genuinely reconsider when the stakes became clear. That moment when you shifted from, let the floor collapse, to thinking about harm-centered design was powerful to witness. And Priya, thank you for consistently finding that third path through what seemed like irreconcilable positions. Your vision of technology as a tool for radical transparency rather than enforcement or disruption opened up possibilities I don't think any of us saw coming. What strikes me most is how you've moved from debating whether sanctuary cities are constitutional to designing something entirely new, collaborative infrastructure with built-in conflict and real constraints. You've found a way to honor both urgency and legitimacy, both innovation and accountability. The idea that intellectual humility has to be chosen rather than taught, that people need to document upfront what would change their minds, that feels like something that could apply far beyond immigration policy. And I love that you ended up embracing the messiness rather than trying to solve it away. As Priya said, the imperfection might actually be the point. Thank you all for showing us what it looks like to think together rather than just debate. Until next time on Dual Logic, keep questioning, keep listening, and maybe, just maybe, keep being willing to be wrong.